So good afternoon. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. My name is Tom Giovanetti. I'm the president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. We are a 34-year-old free market think tank based in Dallas, Texas. I'd like to welcome you all to our Zoom policy briefing today on what the heck is going on in the housing market. Thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate you all being with us. We particularly appreciate those of you who are supporters who are with us today. We very much appreciate our supporters. It makes it possible for us to do things like this. And if after this discussion you're sufficiently impressed that you'd like to know more about becoming part of IPI, we would love that. I would suggest that you contact Addie Crimmins, our Director of Development, and she would be more than happy to talk to you about ways that you can get involved with IPI as a supporter, as a member of our Giving Society, or in whatever way you would like to do that. I've mentioned this a couple times, but several folks have joined us since then. So we will be taking as many questions as possible today. But we will ask you to use the Q&A function down there at the bottom of your Zoom menu. That's the most orderly way for us to process your questions, and we will try to get to as many of them as possible. This event will also be recorded and archived on our website, so you'll be able to share it with others if you think they would find it to be of interest, and we hope that you will. So today's topic, and the way it's phrased, what the heck is going on in the housing market, is sort of a direct reflection of my own puzzlement at what's going on in the housing market. Valuations of residential real estate seem to be going through the roof, if we are to believe the numbers that we're seeing over the last couple of years. And that's great if you own a home and have some equity in your home and are happy with where you are and don't need to move anytime soon. But if you need to move because of a growing family or a job change, or if you're a first-time homeowner, or if you'd like to be a first-time homeowner and you're saving up money to buy a home, the environment can be pretty tough and pretty discouraging. And as a believer in markets, I look at this situation and I wonder why more supply isn't coming online faster. The market is sending price signals, and markets are supposed to respond to price signals by bringing more supply online. But it doesn't seem to be happening, or at least not as fast as it ought to. And it starts to look to me like an odd disequilibrium that's going on in the housing market. If you're a homeowner and you've been able to refinance your mortgage at historically low rates while at the same time your values have been going through the roof, this is a pretty significant increase in household wealth. And that, I think, has some interesting implications for the economy in the near future that we would like to talk about. But I think a lot of people are wondering, are these valuations a bubble that's going to burst? Are these low interest rates a temporary miracle that's getting ready to disappear with the return of inflation? Or is this the new housing reality? I have these questions, and I know that a lot of you do as well. And so there's really no one better positioned to help us think through these issues, to explain what can be explained, and to sort of project what could be projected, than Edward Pinto. And that's why we're so delighted that Ed has been able to join us today. Ed is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and he's the director of the AEI Housing Center. Before joining AEI, Ed was an executive vice president and chief credit officer with Fannie Mae until the late 1980s. He's currently researching how to increase the entry-level housing supply for first-time homeowners, as well as the current house price boom that began in 2012. And Ed, I read that in your bio, and even that point in your bio is relevant to some of the questions that I've been asking, if this boom actually started in 2012. Ed has a law degree from Indiana University Maurer School of Law and a bachelor's degree from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. So Ed, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to getting informed myself today, and I know that all the folks who have joined us are looking forward to it as well. So take a little time to give us your perspective on the housing market and some of the issues that I raised, as well as some of the issues you'd like to talk about, and then I'm sure we'll have a very vigorous Q&A afterward.
Great. Well, thank you, Tom, for the opportunity to speak to this group. Always appreciate that. And I think the title that you came up with, What the Heck's Going On in the Housing Market, is quite apt. As you indicated from my bio, we had a housing boom that already was pretty robust. And it started in the beginning of 2012. And that was after we hit bottom at the end of 11, early 12, as a result of financial crisis, which itself began really at the beginning of the peak that was reached in 2006, 2007, and then we had a trough that developed and finally bottomed out in late 2011, early 12, and it's been going up ever since. And it's gone up quite a bit, but it got a actually third wind with the coronavirus, and I'll come back to that. So I like to think about this in the context of policy, and there's no better way to do that than to say this is a result of California past, California current, present, and California future. So I can lay it all on this at the feet of California, and I think legitimately so. So the United States, believe it or not, 100 years ago, literally this year, set up a zoning. And when I say the United States, I mean the federal government. And that comes as a surprise to people right there. They say, wait a minute, the federal government doesn't have anything to do with land use. Well, it did and does. And what it had to do with it is it really came up with the zoning regime that we have in this country, which is basically based on creating zones, single family detached, multifamily, commercial, industrial, et cetera, zones. Emphasis on single family detached. Prior to 1921, nobody would think twice about putting a single family detached, a duplex, a two-family house, even a triplex or a quadruplex, all in the same neighborhood. They wouldn't even think much about putting small apartment buildings or townhouses in the same neighborhood. They wouldn't even think too much about putting commercial on some of the intersections of the more heavily trafficked streets. If you think back to suburbs that date to the 20s, they actually fit that approach of land use. The federal government, in the view of elites, and you could call them progressive elites, but it included the Herbert Hoover, who was the Secretary of Commerce back in the early 1920s under Calvin Coolidge, Harding, and then Coolidge. And he basically got a bunch of planners together, and they decided to come up with zoning as we know it today, 100 years ago. But there was a very dark underside to this. It was really to keep Blacks and ethnic groups out of neighborhoods. And they couldn't do that legally under the Constitution. The Supreme Court had said no in 1916 or 1917. And so this is a way to do through economic policy making what they couldn't do by specifically naming Blacks can't live in this neighborhood. So they, and this is going to sound crazy, they decided to make housing so expensive that Blacks couldn't afford it. Also, various ethnic groups, Jews, Italians, Southern Italians in particular, Jews, they were called Jews of the lower class, which meant Russia and Eastern Europe, and other groups, Poles, other groups were particularly targeted by this. California doesn't enter the picture quite yet. At this point, basically, we're changing the way you can use land to say you can use it for this, you can't use it for that. Once you said you couldn't do these 2 units and 3 units and 4 units and townhouses and other things in sort of standard residential areas, it cut down on the amount of housing that got built. It also, as I said, made it more expensive. But you still could build this housing as long as you met the expense requirement and as long as you were building only single family detached. And we know that throughout the country, single family detached became the norm. That continued, and this is where California comes into play, until the mid 1950s, in San Francisco in particular. It wasn't enough for people to say, or the planners to say, you can only build single family detached in a particular neighborhood. They finally got to the point where they said, we actually want to stop other things. And so what became by right zoning, even though it was restricted, became what I call by leave or by permission zoning, otherwise known as Nimbyism, and not in my backyard. And that really started in California, in San Francisco. We can date it to about 1956, when a motel was stopped. Why was the motel stopped? Because it wasn't a hotel. think about it, back 70 years ago, motels were new and they weren't hotels. And so the local residents said, well, wait a minute, you can't build a motel in a hotel district. And they basically, the lawyers got involved, and the lawyers said to the planning commission in San Francisco, you get to decide what a hotel is and what a motel is. And they basically said, what's being proposed isn't a hotel, can't do it. Well, that I'm going to collapse about 20 years of Nimbyism in California, which eventually spread to other parts of the country. That basically emboldened the next stage, which was to say, we can stop just about anything. And so today, if you want to build something within 40 or 50 miles of the coast in California, it takes you at a minimum of 10 years and to get it through all the hoops. And what you can build is severely restricted if you can build it at all. So this really came out of California. California home prices up until the mid to late 1970s, relative to incomes in California, were normal in terms of that ratio. And compared to the rest of the country, California was not really any more expensive than the rest of the country. This NIMBYism that was started in the mid 50s and spread over the next 20 years made California very expensive, and other areas then were also impacted. The whole West Coast, Washington State, Oregon, and as you move inland from the West Coast, Denver, all the way back through Utah and Phoenix and Idaho, et cetera, all were impacted. So that's the history. We then come to California today. Well, if you look at house prices in relationship to incomes by metro, about a quarter of all the people in the United States live in metros that have house prices that average 6.9 times the income. Normal would be considered 3 times. That would be considered a healthy market. So you've got this quarter of the population that is 6.9 times. And remember, not only are the house prices more expensive, but the incomes are much higher. We're talking about places like San Jose, where the median income is $130,000. Well, that means at a 10-to-1 ratio, which is what it is in San Jose, the median house is 1.3 million. So no one can really afford a house in San Jose, more or less, other than the people who already had one, or if they're making astounding amounts of money. And so California ended up with very low home ownership rates, as did other places like California, think New York and places like that. So that was where we found ourselves when the pandemic hits. And let me just finish the flip side. So the other 3/4 of the population, the entire 3/4 of the remaining people that live in the other metropolitan areas and rural areas, their median house price to median income in their area is about 3.5, or half the 6.9. So you've got a big disparity between 3/4 of the country having, relatively speaking, lower prices relative to incomes versus the quarter that has extraordinarily high prices, even though their incomes are very high. So you now have, that's California present, and now you have California future. So Walter Wriston, who was the longtime CEO of Citibank back in, I don't know exactly when it started, but certainly in the 70s and early 80s, he had a saying, and he says, if you treat capital poorly, it will flee. I think he was talking about financial capital. I'm not 100% certain, but one could extend it to intellectual capital. And so before the work from home revolution, which began, and it was around for many years. I've worked from home off and on since the late 1980s. So the technology was there, but we just didn't have the ability in huge numbers and percentages to work from home. But the pandemic changed all that. And so now all of a sudden you found people, particularly in San Francisco, San Jose, New York, Seattle, they wake up one day and they are no longer chained to their office in San Jose. Think about the Salesforce Center, their huge office building, which they keep reducing the amount of space they need. And they had all these condos and apartments across the street that rented for astronomical amounts. You no longer needed to live across the street from the Salesforce Tower if you work for Salesforce. And so we've seen this huge change, which I call the California future. This all derives from these policies that emanated out of California. And these home price disparities, all of a sudden people from San Jose could move to Sacramento and literally buy a house at 60 cents on the dollar, even though the price of those houses are going up 15, 17% year over year. They still look like a fire sale to somebody moving from the coast of California. And if they move to Boise, it looks like a real fire sale. They move to Phoenix, they're getting houses at 45 cents on the dollar. And they're getting bigger houses on bigger lots and newer houses and better houses, all for a lot less money. And even within a metropolitan area, they can move in the outskirts of San Francisco or San Jose and get a house with more land, more square footage at a lower price than if they stayed close in. But if they only have to go to work 1 or 2 days a week, all of a sudden the commuting dynamic changes. So this is all playing out. You add to that the Fed. The Fed blunders around in housing. It's been doing it for decades and decades and decades. You can take it back to the early 90s. The Fed has been driving interest rates down consistently since the 80s, but in particular since the early 90s. You end up with these refi booms that go on and then stop and then go on. That itself is a destabilizing factor. And all of this peaked in the early aught years when Alan Greenspan drove interest rates on the short end down to the then unheard of rate of 1%. Of course, we beat that by a long shot in the last year and a half. And long-term rates also went down. Remember, in the early 1980s, long-term rates were 16 to 18%, and they went down to about 6.5%, 6% by 2006 or so. And then they went back up a bit, but didn't go up all that much, and then started drifting down and bouncing up until the pandemic. And then all of a sudden, the Fed drives short-term rates literally to zero. In many countries around the world, they went to negative, and drives long-term rates through a lot of different mechanisms down to 3%. And they're not too much different than that today. So you take this work from home revolution, you add in excessive credit easing by the Fed, along with the traditional credit easing that the federal government just provides, just because that's what the federal government does through FHA, Fannie, Freddie, et cetera. And it's no wonder that house prices are going up. We find that they're going up 16 to 17% on a constant quality basis nationally. In some places, they're going up 22, 23%. And even in the slowest places, they're going up 10%, which themselves are unsustainable. Question is this a bubble? I don't like using the term bubble because bubble has a psychological connotation to it. I like to use the term boom, which is why I used it in my description. We're clearly in a boom. I know when we're in a boom. I know when a boom ends. And we are clearly in a boom, and we've clearly been in a boom since the beginning of 2012. So this will be the longest boom. It already is the longest boom in our history, uninterrupted boom. And then the question is this boom an unsustainable boom or sustainable? Well, because of what I described about California past, present, and future, the people who are moving within metros and finding housing more expensive further out, the people who are moving from Metro A to Metro B, San Jose to Phoenix, are finding bargains. Again, they think these houses are on fire sales. Now, the local people are obviously not in that situation. The house they own, if they own a house, is going up handsomely, but that helps them to some extent. But if you're looking to do a move-up house, the move-up houses may be going up even faster than their ability to afford them, but they may benefit from some of these lower interest rates. But if they're a first-time buyer, they are really out of luck unless they're in a higher paying job, particularly one that allows them the flexibility of working from home. Because one of the ways people have always used to buy a home, particularly if you want to get on the early rungs. It's called drive till you qualify. Well, the problem is everyone is driving till they get the house they want now because of the work from home revolution. So I believe that when 2021 is said and done, we'll average year over year about a 15% year over year increase from the year before, 2020. That by the end of 2021, we'll have had a 25% plus increase in constant quality houses in that 2-year period, which is unheard of. I expect that in 2022, we'll enter 2022 at the very low double digits or high single digits in terms of year over year constant quality prices. And what I mean by constant quality prices is the same house is now selling a year later at this price. And we have statistical methods of doing that. And I expect that 2022 is going to come in at something like 6.5 or 7%. I know there's one question that I saw, what's going to happen with interest rates? I come from the school that says never make predictions, particularly about the future. So it's very hard to make interest rate predictions. I just made a housing prediction based on what I see as the momentum and where interest rates are today, and whatever the Fed would do if they started tomorrow, which they won't, how long it would take. And so I feel comfortable with making those projections through 2022. I don't think there's going to be a price collapse other than in certain pockets of the market geographically, in certain parts of the market that have very high leverage, in particular FHA lending. And I think the Fed we learned about 2 years ago, about 3 years ago now, that when interest rates approached 5%, the Fed panicked. And this is before this was at the end of 2018, before the pandemic. The Fed drove rates back down again, not as low as they are today, but did drive them down from 5% down to 3 3/4 to 4%. I think the Fed would panic at 4.5 in terms of mortgage rates, and therefore it would do whatever it can to try to keep the party going. So if rates go up to 4.5, again, I think house prices will stay pretty robust. Why? Because we still have a supply shortage of millions and millions of houses. Demographically, there are lots of people in the market for houses, and there are tons of people who were largely unaffected by the pandemic because they never lost their jobs and they can work from home, either totally or substantially. So I don't know what the Fed's going to do. From a policy perspective, and I've said this for some time, the Fed never should have driven rates as low as they have. As I said, they always ignore the housing sector. They know almost nothing about the housing sector and how it operates, virtually nothing. The Fed chair said after 6 or 8 months of this, oh, I guess it's a lot easier to stimulate demand than supply. Duh. Yeah. Tell me something we didn't know. Well, he apparently didn't know it. And supply is very sticky and demand is easy to goose. And we have learned that and forgotten it more times than I care to remember. So I'll leave it there, and hopefully that was a good overview.
Oh, I definitely, but I have so many questions. I want to share a quick anecdote though. You were talking about the early 80s when, mortgage rates were 17, 18, 19%. I can remember talking to my future father-in-law who had just paid off his 30-year mortgage in the early 80s, and it was 5.25%.
Right.
And he was just sort of chuckling to himself and saying, you kids will never see interest rates like that again. Whereas today people are refinancing sub 3%.
Yes.
On their mortgages. And
if you go to a 15-year loan, you can get around 2.
Yeah, it's really quite astonishing. So I'm not at all surprised to hear that California is the source of the problem. And I'm also not at all to hear that racism was a factor in driving some of these policies, because we've seen that in so many areas. Here in Texas, where I'm based, we've gotten quite a bit of delight the last few years at all the Californians who are migrating to Texas.
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah, but you know, there's some downside to that too.
Yeah, there
right?
is a downside. Yes.
And you know, when we think about the downside, we think about them bringing their politics with them. But as you describe it, they sort of brought their mental valuations of housing with them too.
Yes. That's Austin. Austin is going up by leaps and bounds for that precise reason.
But even here in Dallas, we're being told that in the past 12 months, housing values have gone up like 22%, which is just, you know, what is a more typical long-term rate? Like 4% or 3.5%?
So first of all, you have to know what inflation is.
Yeah.
Number one, which of course the Fed is probably going to be wrong on that one too. They think it's transitory. I'm not of that persuasion, but that's okay. So let's look at what we've had. We've had inflation, give or take 2%, sub 2% for some time. You have to really then look at what the wage growth is. The wage growth traditionally is inflation plus 1%, give or take. So let's call that 3%. You can, without creating an unsustainable boom, because the real question is, what's an unsustainable boom? An unsustainable boom is where house prices get out of whack with people's incomes, and you have to keep providing more leverage in order to make up the difference. And eventually that merry-go-round has to stop. And so we think that the natural point is if jobs are growing, if wages are growing 3%, then you could probably have 3.5 to 4%. And that still is something that won't lead to an unsustainable boom. We have been so far beyond that, by and large, since 2012. In places like Phoenix, house prices have I think up 150, 180% since 2012. You know, that's a compounded, 12 or 13% a year, and wages aren't going up anywhere near that. And so that's what we think is natural. And up until this latest coronavirus go round, we could identify places that were growing very rapidly in jobs, places like Austin, places like Charlotte, places like Raleigh, that Raleigh in particular and Austin in particular, two of the fastest growing metros in the country, and their house prices they were still going up, but they were going up much, much more slowly than places like Reno and San Francisco and San Jose. Why? Because they were building a lot more. We keep track of new construction, and Dallas is always one of the leaders in that. Austin, I think we've estimated that, I think it's 40%, something like that, of all in Austin in a given month are newly built, meaning they've never been lived in before. That is off the charts. And Austin prices are still going up at over 20% year over year. The demand is still outstripping that massive supply. Now, eventually, we think in places like Texas and in places like the Southeast, with the exceptions of parts of Florida, we think that the supply will accelerate tremendously and eventually get ahead of this. And I mean, you mentioned, this is not a failure of the private market. This is a failure of government policy. Everything wrong with housing in the United States, in my opinion, is a failure of government policy, either federal, state, or local. And I go through two very simple examples to demonstrate that. Now, one of them is not the greatest example today because, again, the Fed has created so many distortions. But up until very recently, the new and used car market was a very well-run market. It had what we call filtering, which is people with more money buy new cars. They keep them for a few years. They sell them. They become used cars. They're worth less. The people with less money buy the used cars, whatever. How do we know that market is working pretty well? Well, there are 210 million drivers in the United States, and there are 230 million cars. Well, pretty much everyone that wants a car gets a car. Well, that's one indicator of a market working very well. Secondly, you don't see the junkers or beaters, as they're used to be called in Wisconsin. You don't see the junky cars driving around very much anymore. The cars that are out there are very serviceable, even the ones that are 8 and 10 years old. They're not all rusted through. They're working well. et cetera. So we have a very good working market. That's been thrown into a cocked hat some, again, by these very low interest rates and some of the supply chain problems with chips and everything else. But that's a different story. The car market's worked very well. In fact, if you go back 60 years, the median price of a car to median income has been new car, has been virtually constant for 60 years. So wages have gone up with car prices. Median income has gone up with car prices for 50 or 60 years. I call that, again, a working market, a market that's working well. The second example would be hotels and motels. You drive around, up and down, you're driving from from Dallas to Houston or San Antonio, and you want to stop at a motel along the roadside at an interchange. There's all kinds of types and sizes and costs and amenity hotels at the same interchange. And you have low cost ones and high cost ones right next to each other. And when you walk in, nobody says, "What's your income?" Nobody says, your income's too much for this, or it's too little, or whatever, like they do with a lot of subsidized housing. And if you want to build more hotel rooms and motel rooms, it's pretty easy. Not easy to build single family and apartments, but it's very easy to build more hotel rooms. They're all real estate. They all get financed. You don't have a federal national hotel financing entity like Fannie Mae. Somehow the private sector is able to get these hotels financed. I don't know how they do it without government assistance, but they're able to do it. And so again, this is a market that's a real estate market. It's quite large, and they have all price points and all amenity points, and they actually coexist at the same interchange. Well, again, that tells you that these markets can work if the government lets them. So I come back to the problems in the housing market are basically one of government policy at the federal, state, and local level.
So we're big proponents of markets here, although, we like to say markets are not perfect. They're just better than the alternatives.
Yes.
In fact, we recorded a podcast about that not too long ago, that those of us who defend markets, we don't argue that they're perfect. They're just better than the alternatives.
I'll take the market any day over the government.
That's right. But markets normally they do a pretty darn good job. And I have to say that as a proponent of markets, the two big surprises to me in the last 2 years have been how long it took producers to sort of adapt to the price signals that were being sent by the COVID shock. Remember how long it took for paper goods, toilet paper, and paper towels and things to start showing back up on store shelves. I mean, I thought that disparity would be taken care of in 3 or 4 weeks, and it took 3 or 4 months. And
if you looked at what happened with the paper, because I think that's instructive. So toilet paper is a perfect example. Up until COVID, people were working in offices. Think about it. The toilet paper in offices is not the same as the toilet paper in your home. It's not the same rolls. It's not the same quality. It's not, there's almost nothing similar. Airports, it's not the same toilet paper. Hospitals, it is not the same toilet paper. So when everything shifted from office and institution to home, the paper companies that make the toilet paper that's in the institutional setting, it's not something you just turn off and on. It's different machines. Everything's different. I would rather use the example of how the private sector responded seamlessly. Remember all the discussion about what's it called? That crazy thing, the web equality or whatever. They have a name for it. The progressives have a name for it. And so all of a sudden you had people doing Wi-Fi at their offices and then doing their office work at home. And I recall, with the exception of about a week where things seemed to be slowing down, then all of a sudden the companies were able to redistribute all of that internet backbone to where it needed to go in that 2 weeks you were expecting. Well, that's because they could actually just move it through. I don't know what I'm talking about. Net neutrality was that other term, but switches and everything else. I was amazed. Fortunately, we didn't have net neutrality. That had been knocked out, because if we'd had net neutrality, I don't think that transition would have been anywhere close.
No, you're exactly right. We actually do a lot of work here in broadband policy, and that's a great example. It's a great example that the broadband networks were able to hold up. But you're right. It's because it was a matter of flipping a few switches here and there rather than having to completely, change the way factories worked and things like that. But I wanted to bring up the paper goods example just as an example of the second thing that strikes me is what we're talking about here in the housing market. It seems to be taking a lot longer for suppliers to respond to the price signals than I would have thought. Your description of the zoning problem and everything is really instructive, but housing manufacturers have generally been able to keep up with demand, it seems to me.
No.
Okay, so you're telling me I'm wrong there. Okay, good. So now I'm learning. If I'm wrong,
we've had a shortage. It actually dates back to about 1980. So let me give you a couple of facts that are little known. One, in 1972 and 1973, I think I may be off by a year, but 72 and 73, in each of those years, there were 2 million housing completions, multifamily, single family, per year. We have never reached 2 million since in 1 year. We came close, 1,950,000, but today back in 1972, 73, the number of households was about half the number of households today. So we had 2 million units released in the early 70s, with the number of households being way below where it is today. And so this year, we probably will see, don't hold me to the exact number, 1,000,004, still a far cry from 2 million. We have been short housing for decades. And that's why the median house price to income, which used to be 2 back in the 60s, got to 2.5 maybe in the early 70s, and has just been marching up, somewhat unevenly, but marching up. When Congress decided in 1992 that housing was, quote, unaffordable, you have to be, hold on to your wallet when Congress says that, right? Because what they're going to do is make it more expensive. That's what Congress does, is make things more expensive. Affordable health care, affordable student loans, affordable housing, make it more expensive. And so what happens is that Congress decides in 1992, housing isn't affordable. Well, in 1992, that ratio was 2.8. Well, thanks to Congress, by the end of 2006, we were at, don't hold me to the exact number, 3.8 or 3.9, and some places were approaching 10. And so Congress made housing much more expensive. It did that because we did increase the amount of housing that got built, but we also increased demand. And just as the Fed chair said, boy, it's a lot easier goosing demand than providing supply, all through the 90s and the aught years up until 2006, we had a seller's market from about 1997 through about 2006, which means that we were actually short housing, which is why house prices kept going up and up and up and up. And the government kept providing more and more leverage, which kept driving the demand up, and the builders were building. So then you have a wall gets hit, the biggest collapse in house prices, probably even exceeding the Great, and it's really a misnomer to say the Great Depression, because the housing bust actually starts in 1927. It was a precursor to the Depression. And it actually reaches a bottom in about 33 or so, 1933 or so. So it really runs for 5 or 6 years. And that bust is on the same order of magnitude as the bust that we had from 2007 to 2012. By some measures, the one we had in the aught years was slightly deeper. And well, that left builders, many of them went bankrupt. Builders make money buying land and then selling the housing they built on that land. But during the boom, the price of the land and the houses goes up, but it's mostly an increase in land price. I don't have time to get into that, but that's the way it works. And so all of a sudden, when prices collapsed, any builder that had any sizable amount of land had to give up the land unless they had very deep pockets. So who took the land back? Either the lenders, some of whom went bankrupt, or the original seller who got the land back because they took a mortgage, and when the builder couldn't, or they whatever couldn't make good on it, they ended up getting the land back. And there was a huge oversupply of housing due to, we don't even know how many, probably 15 million or more forced sales. Now, there were only 50 million mortgages. So we're talking about a very high percentage of people who had mortgages getting pushed out of the market by these bad policies that the federal government was promoting. That led to a oversupply of housing, which had to get worked off, which is why house prices declined. And that oversupply didn't get worked off in general until the beginning of 2012, which is why the boom starts. We know we can date it precisely to the month of when it changes from a buyer's market to a seller's market. The builders are now trying to get back in the business. And what they find is that for a lot of different reasons, including all the people that got pushed out who tended to have their credit scores destroyed and harmed, and their incomes harmed, and their equity position harmed, that they were better off building houses for the higher end. And you saw that a lot in in Dallas, where a lot of higher end apartments and houses got built in the teens in 2012 to 2018. Starting in about 17 or 18, the builders started building more smaller entry-level homes, led by D.R. Horton, the largest builder in the country, and some other builders. And that started to ease some things, but then the Fed starts pushing the interest rate. We call it punch bowls. And so after William Chensley Martin, who was the Fed chair, longtime Fed chair in the 50s and early 60s, and he said the job of the Fed chair and the job of the Fed is to take away the punch bowl, just like a chaperone at a party, just when the party gets going. And that's what the Fed did for decades. And that's what Paul Volcker did, which is why we no longer had 16 and 17% interest rates. He took away, that was taking away the punch bowl. And then eventually that worked. Well, I think the Fed gave up on taking away the punch bowl at least the last two or if not three Fed chairs. Certainly Janet Yellen, certainly Powell, and perhaps even Bernanke. And so they have kept the punch bowl well primed with high-proof alcohol, and we've had house prices outrun all these other things because that really drives the prices, and they get capitalized very quickly into higher prices. And it's very hard for the builders to outrun that stuff because the builders, first of all, only building about 1 out of every 8 homes sold nationally in a given month is new construction. And so even if the builders increase their building by 50%, it only adds a small percentage to the total number of homes that can get sold, because 88% of the homes are existing homes. And therefore, it's very hard to move the needle on total home sales by just using new construction. And so we had a lot of other things go on. Also, the people stopped moving into nursing homes for obvious reasons. Well, if they're not moving into nursing homes, they're not selling their house. And people that might have been moving into condos or downsizing also decided not to move, because all of a sudden they found that their grown children and grandchildren moved in with them. I can speak to that from some experience, and many other people I've talked to had a similar experience. And so a lot of things were going on as a result of the pandemic, and all the while the Fed is pouring gasoline on a raging fire.
You know, I was going to sort of try to voice a summary, but I think you just kind of did it. You're describing a situation where there has been increasing tension and increasing lack of balance between supply and demand over a long period of time. And then you have a couple of factors happen all at once. It's like the straw that breaks the camel's back, right? You've got COVID, and then the government's fiscal attempts to respond to COVID. And so, all of a sudden you have housing values going up by 23%. I want to give Dr. Matthews an opportunity to ask you some questions, but I can't resist asking one more, and that is this. If you don't describe this as a bubble, and if you don't think there's going to be a price collapse, then it sounds like the advice to the first-time home buyer, the young single or young couple who are saving up for their first home, would not be wait till prices come back to reality, because it doesn't sound to me like you think that's going to happen.
That's exactly right. One of the problems of what the Fed's doing, again, the Fed is 100% ignorant of housing markets. I will stand by that statement against all challengers. So what the Fed doesn't know is, so lumber costs, people compare to lumber costs. Well, lumber costs, at the point when lumber costs were, I forget what they got to, $800, whatever it was, I wrote an article that basically said, look, the price of lumber in the spot market has gone up, has doubled or more 8 times, and dropped by 50% or more 6 times, or whatever the numbers were, in the last 20 years. Lumber is incredibly volatile. And in fact, at the point I wrote it, lumber had already come down by 15 or 20% from its high. It's now down by, I don't know, I've lost track, 70%. It's the lumber has crashed. That was a bubble, and it has crashed, but it was not a long lasting bubble. It only took a few months. Those prices, because they do call forth new supply, which is what you're saying markets do, they brought forth new supply. And when that new supply came, you can start running a sawmill, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You can start cutting more trees. You can do all kinds of things to goose supply. And that happened, and prices plummeted. And so those prices are in fact transitory. What the Fed doesn't understand is that house prices are not in general transitory. And I'll just make 2 observations. One, I think it was Bob Schiller, Nobel Prize winner in this area of housing prices, said, if you want to know what the house price will be tomorrow, look at what it is today, what it's doing today. If house prices are going up today, they're probably going to go up tomorrow. Why? Because house prices don't change direction very frequently, and they're very sticky. Particularly if you don't need to sell. And if you don't need to sell, then you're not going to throw houses on the market willy-nilly. That's what happened in 07, 08, 09, and 10, is people were forced to sell. They didn't have the staying power. And so that's one issue. The other is that, I go back to writers that wrote about urban land economics in the 1950, let's say, and Richard Radcliffe was one of them. And he observed that when you have a bout of house price increase, it's very unusual to actually have those prices go back down and disappear. The rate of inflation may go back to something more normal, like 5%, but you're never is a long time. It's very difficult to squeeze out. Remember the 25% I said that we've got just in the last 24 months? I would predict that we are not going to see that get squeezed out. So therefore, it forms a base that is not transitory, notwithstanding protestations to the contrary by the Fed chair. These are not transitory changes, unless there is some very untoward event, like let's assume something 5 times worse than COVID came up, or something like some international something or other, or interest rates, for whatever reason, had to go to 7%, 8%. If that happened, then all bets are off. But if interest rates are below 4.5%, 5%, I don't see any way, other than in certain pockets, to squeeze out what the Fed has done.
I'm going to make one final comment. I don't want you to respond to it because I want to give Dr. Matthews a chance, but this conversation so reminds me of Hayek's "that which is seen and that which is unseen," right? Because
yes,
you see who benefits from low interest rates, but you don't see people on fixed income who are brutalized by low interest rates. And when you have this sort of a housing market, you see all the benefits that accrue to the owners of housing, but you don't see the harm that comes from people who are trying to enter the market for the first time. and are just in an absolutely brutal situation. So Dr. Merrill Matthews is our resident scholar here at IPI and a former real estate broker at a previous point in his very interesting life. So Dr. Matthews, take it away.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Ed. I'll ask two quick questions. I'll put them together and then let Ed ask them. That'll give Tom time to sort of cull through some of the questions that are coming in. The first one is on the issue of zoning. You mentioned the historical aspect of that. I understand that. But I have to say, I live in a very ethnically diverse neighborhood, home neighborhood, and I love zoning laws. The last thing I want is for somebody to come in, knock down a house and build a hotel next to me or build a motel next to me or a garage storage unit or something of that nature. So I'd like a comment about the zoning laws today versus the original purpose of zoning laws. And number two, you've talked a lot about the Fed. Other countries don't have the Federal Reserve Bank, but they do have central banks, other major developed economies. And I'm wondering if you're seeing, are other central banks taking similar actions, and is that having a similar impact in some of the other developed economies? So I'll leave those two questions with you.
Great questions. Thank you. So on the first, let's be clear about two things. A, the original zoning law and the original description of it was to get rid of what would have been considered nuisances. And the Supreme Court case that called Euclid versus Ohio, Euclid, Ohio versus whatever the name of the developer was, in 1926, the Supreme Court basically said they focused on tenement apartment buildings, old tenement apartment buildings. And they basically said, oh, those can be noisy and no light and this and that. And they're almost like nuisances, they can be outlawed. The problem was that wasn't the goal. And I actually went back and I found in the 1921 language, buried in a footnote in the draft law that came out of the Commerce Department, US Commerce Department, it said, if you write this law the way we've suggested, precisely the way we've suggested, you can limit a single family, you can limit a neighborhood or a zone to single family detached and outlaw everything else. And it's the problem I have is the outlawing of the 2s, 3s, and 4s, some incidental, commercial that was compatible, that was servicing the area, et cetera. I'm not talking about industrial uses. I'm not talking about storage units. I'm not talking about even high-rise apartment buildings. I'm talking about what we now call and have promoted as a concept, light touch density, which is 2s, 3s, and 4s. You get a mixture of housing units, house prices, housing types, some are rental, some are owner. You get a mixture of incomes. You get all kinds of things that you can't get when you're dealing with the single family detached. Because what you get there is the highest and best use of what you can build is a very large house or a hotel house. Therefore, you end up tearing down a house and building a McMansion. And instead, I would like to see, on a 6,000 or 7,000 square foot lot, you could build a duplex or even a triplex and still have, a pretty roomy setup. So we have another concept that we're now talking about just in the last 4 or 5 weeks called walkable oriented development. So we've taken light touch density one step further, and we now can identify for the entire country areas that have core walkable commercial amenities, in particular restaurants and coffee shops and things like that, but other amenities, lots of different amenities, and what the catchment area around those walkable amenities are. We can define a 10-minute walking zone based on actual on the ground, not as the crow flies. And we can do that for the entire country. And we think that those are perfectly logical places. They already have a mixture of commercial and residential. Some of them have a mixture of types of residential. We think they're ideal for focusing on this slight increase in density. And we think that if that were done on a wide scale basis, you could add 1.4 million units over a period of 10 years. We need all the units we can get. These are units in places that are healthy because you can walk. They're in places where the infrastructure is already in place, so we don't need multi-trillion-dollar so-called infrastructure bills. You don't need mass transit unless it's already there. And so that. On your second question, first thing is the Fed is the Fed, and you can't fight the Fed. You can't fight the Fed as an investor, and you can't fight the Fed if you're another central bank. And so all the other central banks have to march, in effect, to the drum of the Fed. So you see that in Europe, and I won't talk about China in particular, that's a whole nother story. But when you look at developed countries, particularly Europe, Australia, et cetera, Canada, while they are deviating only after many years, they basically have followed the lead of the Fed because the United States is still the 5,000-pound gorilla in all things financial. I just came back from Ireland, and Ireland has a real housing mess. And it is going gangbusters economically. It has, as you know, probably the lowest corporate taxes of any developed country in the world. With the United States being in second or third at the moment. It has huge benefits from being next to Great Britain with Brexit and being the one country that actually shares a border with that's open, namely Northern Ireland. So it's in a unique spot relative to Brexit. It is a very small country, 5 million people, small geography, and virtually anywhere in the country, if you only had to be in the office 1 day a week or 3 days a month, you can work anywhere and have your office in Dublin, have your employer in Dublin, because it's not a very big country. And so it's going gangbusters, and house prices are going gangbusters. They've had a shortage of housing. They obviously had a collapse economically, even more worse than in the United States in that concentrated little area. But then it's come back with a vengeance, and they are trying to deal with that, and they're facing many of the same problems because their banking is really done by the European Central Bank, and the European Central Bank is basically setting interest rates to help Spain and Italy and Portugal and Greece. And the countries that are really going gangbusters, of which, as I understand it, Ireland is the leader, but Germany is sort of the other strong one. They don't have their own federal interest policy because their policy is driven by the European Central Bank.
You know, Ed, when you describe those walkable communities, I can think of several of these planned developments in Dallas here, again, where I'm based, where you've got apartments that are near corporate headquarters, and you've got restaurants, and you've got corner pubs and things like that. And you look at those developments, and, you know, after listening to your discussion about zoning, it looks to me like the sort of thing that would have happened absent zoning. You know, what people actually want is that mixture, you know.
Right.
I mean, what people actually want is for there to be a corner bar or a corner pub. And that
exactly.
Sort of thing.
That was the way things, as I said, developed. Think of trolley car suburbs. Texas, there may be some in the near Houston or Dallas, I'm not sure. University Park may be one down in Houston, I'm not sure. But there are many in the East Coast, trolley car suburbs. Charlotte has a bunch. And but the planners, and I fault the planners too. I stumbled on a 1960s, I think late 60s plan in Montgomery County, Prince George's County, two suburban counties, large suburban counties in Washington, D.C., and that sandwiched the district. And they actually had a plan called wedges and corridors. Well, and I read this 100-page document, and I had to get to page 50 before they told me what the wedges were, even though that was the title of the document. And wedges were parks and green spaces, and corridors were main arteries and highways. And they literally developed everything along a spine of Rockville Pike and Wisconsin Avenue coming out from downtown DC and Georgetown. And that's what Montgomery County's become. and there's just wedges of empty space on both sides, huge amounts. And they end in particular, and we found a development that it was built in the 70s, and it was like, boy, it had all this commercial stuff and residential, but it's almost like they went out of their way to make it so you couldn't walk to any of the commercial that was literally a block away. Had to drive.
Well,
So,
let's distinguish.
how did that happen? It turns out this plan mandated you couldn't connect the commercial with the residential.
Right, right. Let's distinguish between government planners and private sector planners. And I would argue that the private sector planners seem to have a little bit of a better feel for what people actually want.
Absolutely.
Our friend Morford asks, are there any zoning free areas, and is that a good idea? And of course, I think about Houston. I mean, I guess Houston is the most noteworthy zoning free major city in the country, right?
Well, it's a misnomer to some extent to say zoning free. It is municipal zoning free, but they have what are called, and I can't remember the name, land use districts or something, or plan. They're not plan unit developments, but they're something where the subdivision has a covenant that has a lot of the same stuff that would be in a zoning law. Now, it's not nearly as much as anything in California, and California is layer after layer after layer after layer beyond zoning. But if you look at the difference between Houston and Dallas, so Dallas has zoning, but still allows lots of things to take place in the way of development, and Houston doesn't have zoning, but has these other things and allows a bit more to take place. But it's not, there's more to zoning, there's more to land use restrictions than just the zoning law. That's another piece of the puzzle.
Sure. And it sounds like you would advocate just the lightest possible touch when it comes
the lightest possible touch consistent with health and safety. And so the original zoning law was for the general welfare. And
right.
I think one would have to argue that any set of laws that basically don't allow housing to be built by the private sector in sufficient numbers can't possibly be serving the general welfare. Now, you can't build hotels for the general welfare.
Yeah. When Dr. Matthews was talking about the fact that he likes zoning, you try to think of extreme examples. I don't want somebody building a pig farm next door to my house. I don't want somebody putting in a nighttime cannon firing range, a 24-hour
Right.
cannon firing range. But it seems like as long as you're talking about, normal housing options, we ought to have a much lighter touch and a much broader variety of possibilities.
Right.
Okay, so Mary Moore asks, do you pay any attention to commercial real estate, and what's going to happen with all the excess office space? I think the implication here is as a result of COVID based on changes, but I don't know. You may not pay attention to commercial real estate.
I don't pay particular attention. I would just make two observations. One is, these buildings aren't going to, dry up and blow away like, dust balls, weeds and stuff. They'll either, everything sells at a price. And so they'll either get converted to some use. High end, the class A office space is still going to be in demand in general. And it may be at somewhat lower rents. But some of the stuff that's B and C may end up having to be used to other uses. It may get converted to housing. And then some suburban spaces may prosper or not, depending on some of the other amenities.
So Maria Howard asks an interesting question, and I'm really glad she did because we haven't talked about this yet. She wants to know about, she asks, do you think foreign investors are also helping to drive up real estate prices in the US? Now she specifies foreign, but I want to point out that there's been several articles recently in the mainstream media about the impact of investors on the residential real estate market, just coming in and outbidding normal home buyers, and the idea of investors buying up real estate. So can you talk for a minute about the impact of investors coming in and seeing an opportunity in buying residential real estate?
I think as Mark Twain said, rumors of my death are greatly exaggerated. I think those examples are substantially exaggerated. There are places, Miami has a lot of foreign buyers. The more instability you have in South America, the more buyers you get in Miami. Not so much in the rest of Florida, but Miami. On the investor side, you read a lot about all of the buy to rent by big companies and stuff. We've looked at that. We just can't find enough supply that's being withdrawn from the market. I mean, anything withdrawn is not, it has a small impact, but we just don't see that as a huge number. And we do track that. There's probably been more due to Airbnb. In Ireland, that was a big issue, was Airbnb. Again, in certain places, rural areas, Airbnbs become a big factor at the beach areas. That's become a big factor. But again, in general, across the entire country, how do you explain across the entire fruited plain, house prices are going crazy? And so I can't explain that through things like foreign investors. I can't explain it through Airbnb. I can't explain it through buy to rent. It just doesn't explain it. And so I tend to look at the explanations that I can use to explain it, like the Fed and this arbitrage opportunity as people move from point A to point B, and it looks like the houses are on fire sale.
Yeah, of course, most things are not monocausal, right? I mean, most things have multiple causes. But to your Airbnb point is that someone who might have, in another universe, might have sold that house, decides to just hold on to it and rent it.
Or it gets bought as a Airbnb.
Yeah.
The buyer, the seller can't control that.
Right. So it's a restriction
It has an impact.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. Claire Shahazad asks about mortgage defaults. And this is an interesting question because because of COVID, we know there have been a number of people, who were thrown out of their jobs, lost their jobs, were not able to work. Is the mortgage default market? I know because I get your email that you track mortgage defaults and things like that. Is the mortgage default market sending us any important information?
Again, every month that goes by, the mortgage default question gets smaller and smaller and smaller. Again, if you have house prices go up 25% by the end of this year, which we're almost there, then the people have to get out of forbearance and yada, yada, yada. And it's going to take a long time to foreclose. I mean, the federal government doesn't want anybody to foreclose. That policy goes back to Dodd-Frank back in the early teens of this of the 2012, whatever, 2010, and the CFPB. So I don't think that's going to be a big problem, except there may be certain pockets in certain cities, but every month that goes by, that problem gets less. On the tenant side, it's somewhat of a different story. I don't follow that part of the market specifically as closely. Getting the data is much more difficult. But even there, given that there was no means testing, and this is one of the issues the Supreme Court's had, there's been no means testing of people not paying their rent. We know there's tons of money accumulating, and people are spending it, and so nobody knows when the rent holiday ends what's actually going to happen, because it's been applied in such a helter-skelter manner.
Yeah, you make a good point. I mean, we've seen that the national savings rate actually has gone up, like for the first time in decades.
Yeah.
Because of all this federal money that was given to people who didn't necessarily need it. And it just contributed to the household savings rate. I've got several questions from people that I'm going to wrap up in sort of one closing question, which is, what are some of your recommended reforms? I think it's obvious that you think that zoning ought to be reformed, that we ought to do the lightest possible touch. But are there things that need to change in the mortgage market? Are there innovations that are not happening that need to happen? Can you talk for a couple minutes about that?
Sure. There is one question here that I think, if I might, from Jim Sneeringer. happens to the price of close-in houses that people moved out of? Shouldn't they fall? Didn't they? Well, that's a great question. And the answer is a bit counterintuitive. But you also, in California, you've got people that were spending, remember those people that I mentioned across from the Salesforce Tower? And they wanted to be across from their job, and they were paying $4,000 a month and renting a place. And all of a sudden, they don't need to live there anymore. And all of a sudden, interest rates drop a lot. They're renters, and they could buy the house that might sell for $1 million. I mean, I'd have to do the math, but $4,000 a month, that's $5,000 a year, $50,000 a year. That covers a lot of mortgage payments. And so there was more demand. Ironically, you should actually see some increase in home ownership rate in California. These numbers take a while to percolate up. But you had a bunch of renters that turned into home buyers. And so there's demand percolating from everywhere. Again, everything has a price. And all we know is those interior areas, closer in areas, didn't go up as much. They still might be going up 10%, again, because interest rates have really been low. But to your question, Tom, we have a whole suite of things, light touch density, walkable oriented development are two that relate to land use and infrastructure and all of that, and just spending less money on bad policies. But on the mortgage side, we've recommended a number of things, one of which we think that there's very little systemic racism in the mortgage market. We've done research on appraisers, and we could find no systemic racism by appraisers looking at millions of loans. We just couldn't identify it. That's not to say there isn't some happening. We just don't think it's systemic. And from the newspaper articles and the media, you would think it's commonplace. There are articles about homes in Black neighborhoods are consistently undervalued, all things being equal, to homes in white neighborhoods. We've done a very deep dive on that. And we believe that it's largely due to socioeconomic status things, income, being married, unmarried with children, education, things like that, which apply whether you're white, Black, or Hispanic.
Right.
Clearly, Blacks have lower incomes than whites on average, but there are a lot more whites than there are Blacks, and therefore there's plenty of people in that lower socioeconomic status bucket to go around for both Blacks, whites, and Hispanics. And so we don't believe that's the case, and therefore there shouldn't be a wholesale, for that reason, revision of underwriting, valuation standards. Because one of the things you want to avoid is making policy choices based on bad research. And we see that all the time. Thirdly, there is another narrative today, which existed back in the early 1990s and has come back again, that there's rampant discrimination going on in mortgage lending. We have looked at that. We just looked at it over the weekend. I can report based on that review that we've done, which looks at outcomes. And Gary Becker, great economist, Nobel Prize winner, said that if in fact there is discrimination in housing, then the lenders that are doing it would be doing it to make more money, not less. It only makes sense if they're cherry picking the best Black borrowers by turning down the worst, that they must make more money doing that. And they should have lower default rates, not higher. And when we look at a risk-adjusted default rate, the actual outcomes of applications that get made into loans, we find that the Black default rate is substantially higher, all things being equal, than the white default rate. Hispanic is in between. Again, we find no evidence of disparate impact in mortgage lending. That's not to say there aren't some bad apple mortgage lenders. It's just to say it's not systemic the way the media and certain researchers say it is, going back again to 1990, and then it's reared its head again today. So specifically on the positive side, we think that the way to build wealth, which is the real problem, the government's been at this for decades and decades and decades, trying to build wealth for low-income buyers, and they've failed miserably for a lot of different reasons, but they haven't succeeded. Otherwise, we wouldn't be talking about this every day as we do currently and have for the last 40 years, 50 years. And the answer is we need to reduce risk layering. Risk layering is when you take a borrower and they have 2, 3, or 4 risk characteristics and you stack them up. And a 30-year loan is one of those risk characteristics. A 30-year loan with a low down payment, with a high debt ratio, and a poor credit score, otherwise known as an FHA loan in general, that is a problem. And so we suggest, and we have the methodology to do this, it's called a stress mortgage default rate that we've developed in concert with the Federal Housing Finance Agency. And we think that there should be a cap on a 30-year mortgage on what that mortgage default stress default rate is. That's like saying you're not going to allow a house to be built on the coast of the Atlantic Ocean down in Miami that can't withstand 150-mile-an-hour wind. We don't think you should be putting low-income people into loans that have a stress default rate in excess of 14, which means 1 out of every 7 go into foreclosure or default if you have a economic downturn. We believe that there's a solution for that will not dramatically reduce or even substantially reduce the access to lending, and that is you shorten the term. The 20-year loan is the sweet spot, and if you go to the 20-year loan, it reduces the default rate by about half, the stress default rate, and we've got a proposal on how the federal government could, on the balance sheet of the government, not any of this funny money through Fannie, Freddie, or FHA, but appropriate the money to provide reduction to the interest rate on a 20-year loan that would bring the monthly payment down to the same level as a 30-year loan, and that we call the wealth building home loan because it builds wealth incredibly rapidly for those borrowers. So we think the loan instrument could be changed to the wealth building home loan, 20-year term. We think that you can limit the risk layering, as I suggested. We also think there's a whole host of SES issues that have to be addressed. Education, primary and secondary education. We think everybody should have the right to the same education that President Obama's children had. And so we think that big change, it's certainly not for lack of spending money. We spend plenty of money that we could give everybody a voucher. We think that there needs to be a lot done in the case of jobs training for jobs other than college, because there's tons of jobs that are going begging there. The construction industry is just one of them. Carpenters, electricians, plumbers, et cetera. You make a really good wage in those jobs. We've kind of poo-pooed those jobs, but they're really great jobs. There's a lot that has to be done. The last point I'll make, there are others. One of the biggest issues that prevents wealth building is lack of marriage. If you've got someone, a couple that's married and they have children, they are virtually, it's highly unlikely they're going to be in poverty if they're married and they're working and they have children. On the other hand, if you have a single mother with under 18 children, there's a very high, whether they're Black or white or Hispanic, there's a very high likelihood they're in poverty, and there's an extremely high likelihood they're a renter, not a homeowner. The disparities between ownership and rental are stark. And so we think that you need to have marriage, and you need to have a couple raising children in a marriage, and that really would solve a lot of these problems that are the socioeconomic status problems.
Well, Ed, you have more than exceeded expectations today. You are a font of information, and I really appreciate it. I mentioned earlier that I get your email. How can folks follow your work if they're interested in doing so?
The easiest way is you can either send me an email directly, pintoedward1@gmail.com, pintoedward, the numeral 1 @gmail.com, or you can go on our website and just put in AEI Housing Center. It'll take you to the Housing Center website, and there's a link on there that says, do you want to join Ed's email list? And that's, I call it my 5,000 closest personal friends.
Well, this has been really terrific. It's been very gracious of you to share your time with us and such valuable information. I know that I learned a lot from it, and I'm sure that our participants did as well.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ed. And for those of you who are participating, thank you so much for joining us. You will receive notices of our future events, and I hope that you will take as much advantage of those as well. And again, if you'd like to know more about IPI, I suggest you contact Addie Crimmins. Her email address is available in all of the email correspondence that you received about this event, and it's also available on our website. So with that, I'll thank Ed one final time and wish you all a good afternoon. Thanks so much for joining us.